Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Bridget Quigg. I'm the Communications Manager at Socrata, and we are happy to have you today for this GovStat Hangout with Beth Blauer. We have an amazing panel of performance stat experts with us, and the title of the Hangout today is 3 Lessons in Data-Driven Government Success. You'll hear a lot of stories of their experiences, and they're going to come to you with advice about leadership and choosing data sets and other important work. So with that, I'm going to just make sure you know that you can tweet us at GovStat on Twitter, and you can also write us your comments on YouTube or on our live streaming page for this Hangout. Beth, take it away.
Well, thanks everyone for joining us for our second installment, and also bearing with some of the technical issues that we're having this morning, this afternoon, wherever you are in the world. I'd like to thank you and invite you to continue to join us. This is the second in our series of GovStat Hangouts that we're going to be doing. Again, this is a free-flowing conversation. I am so excited today about our panel because they are people that I work with frequently and that I have been working and observing and learning from throughout my career as a performance stat professional. So I am incredibly excited to be with them today. I'm going to introduce them. We are still experiencing some technical difficulties, so Daniel Hadley, the director of Somerset in the city of Somerville, will hopefully be joining us. I'm joined by Chad Kenney, the director of City Stat in my home city of Baltimore. Oliver Wise, the director of Office of Performance and Accountability in the city of New Orleans. Matt Power, who is the director of State Stat in the state of Maryland. And Emily Love, who's the director for Focus on Results in the city of Atlanta. So I just want to thank everyone for joining us today, and I'm just looking forward to having the discussion. Again, for those of you that are joining us to observe the Hangout, I encourage you to ask questions. So again, you can tweet us at GovStat, at Socrata, or just sending all the information in through Twitter, or if you don't want to ask questions now but have questions later, you'll be able to access all of our information, including a recap of the Hangout on our website. So thanks, everyone, and why don't we go ahead and get started. The first thing I wanted to do with everyone on the phone was just to talk a little bit about the history of your GovStat programs. Your performance stat programs. So performance stat is sort of a methodology that's employed sort of in different variations in all of your governments. And I'd like to start, Chad Kenney, with you as sort of the anchor in our group, coming from Baltimore City, probably one of the oldest programs, if not the oldest programs for a complete government-wide performance stat program. So Chad, why don't you give us just a little bit of a description about the program and a little bit about your history.
Sure. So again, my name is Chad Kenney. Thanks for having me on, Beth. We started 13 years ago in 2000. I believe our 13th birthday is coming up in a couple of weeks. Then Mayor Martin O'Malley had a consultant in for improving CompStat and crime reduction, and they realized that this is an idea that they could apply to all the agencies. So they started CityStat in June 2000. We started with really basic personnel data collected in Microsoft Word documents, and it's evolved significantly since then. We have, I believe, 12 different meetings on a 4-week rotation. The measures we collect are across the board, and we've gone from very agency-based meetings to more of a hybrid where we still have many meetings that are agency-based, and then a couple that are focused on citywide issues. I think that's it. Beth, what did I miss?
No, I mean, I think just to get us started, that was perfect. And I'd love to now turn it over to Oliver Wise, who is joining us from the city of New Orleans. And I think that he has a great story to tell. So Oliver, why don't you tell us a little bit about the program that you run in New Orleans and some of the great work that you're doing? Oliver, I think you're still muted a little bit. Let's see.
All right, here we go.
There you are. Yeah, thanks.
All right. Mayor Landrieu came to office in May 2010. He was my boss. That's when I joined the administration as well. And when the Landrieu administration came to office, there was really no performance management practices at all. No, there was no emphasis on using data to be more accountable to citizens to help drive decisions. And I mean, management within City Hall was really just woeful. And so when our CAO, Andy Coblin, had his first press conference, he said, I'm going to use a Baltimore-style city stat program to run City Hall. And that approach to management got its first legs in terms of monitoring the implementation of Mayor Landrieu's blight strategy. So within 100 days or so, Mayor Landrieu announced a big goal for reducing blight in New Orleans. And blight, that's abandoned delinquent homes, is a huge problem here, among the worst in the country. And announced a strategy for dealing with that problem, a goal of reducing blight by 10,000. And part of the strategy was to create a blight stat program. So every couple weeks now, it's every month, we meet with all the important players in city government who are involved in contending with our blight problem. And we review a series of performance measures to see how we're doing, and we review what's working, what's not, what we need to do to improve. And that program was very well received. Those meetings were public, and we got a lot of citizen involvement in that program. And then with that momentum, that program was launched in November 2010. We got together some funding in the 2011 budget, which starts January 1st, to create our office. It's myself and a team of 4 analysts, and we have a series of other stat programs for high priority cross-departmental initiatives, and then a quarterly report card, which we call Results NOLA, which reports out on the performance measures for all departments.
Great. Thank you so much, Oliver. All right, Emily, why don't you tell us a little bit about the program that you oversee in the city of Atlanta, and a little bit about the work that you're doing.
Sure. So Atlanta is a little bit unique compared to some of the other cities. We were actually a very early adopter for the performance stat program, and we actually initiated our initial program back in 2007. The program got off to a great start. It was largely driven by the leadership over that program, however, and when that leadership stepped aside about 3 years later, the program went through a series of ups and downs, is probably the best way to put it. And what we ended up doing is about a year ago, so this time last year, before I joined the team, the program had gotten to the point where while we were measuring data and collecting information on the city's performance in a number of different areas, we'd gotten to the point where we weren't actually able to use that data to drive results. So we were in a situation that I like to call metric proliferation. If I look back at the database for where we were last year, there were over 1,000 metrics that we were tracking for various city departments, and I can pretty much guarantee that if you asked any commissioner to name the top 10 metrics that they cared about, they wouldn't have been able to answer that question. So we had tons and tons of data, but it wasn't helping us make decisions, and it wasn't actually driving results. So what we decided to do, and I use the term we loosely, our COO, who had actually been the woman who initiated our STAT program, decided to put the program on hold. And so we took about 6 months to really take a step back and think about how we wanted to relaunch the program. We did a lot of research, actually speaking to a number of the folks who are on this call and to other cities. We brought in a consultant team, and what we ended up doing is relaunching the program in January of this year. We have completely rebranded as the For Atlanta team, which stands for Focus on Results Atlanta. And our focus is both going back to that sort of core performance management component and really using core metrics. We're looking at no more than 10 to 15 metrics for each department, and really focusing on those metrics that are visible to the public, so they're metrics that people care about, they're metrics that we can actually manage and use to drive performance, and they're metrics that we can capture. So one of the challenges we had before is we tried to get aspirational, and when you couldn't capture the key metric you wanted, you captured 15 other things that sort of got to the point. So we're focusing on what we can measure, what is visible to the public, and what it will actually drive results. And then we've also expanded the focus of the team, and we actually have another half to the team, which is focused on actually driving improvement within the department. And we have a couple of folks from the private sector who have worked in consulting who are actually going in when we identify performance issues and partnering with those departments to actually implement the changes and to make sure that the operations components of it get off the ground. So we do a lot of the actual performance management work behind the scenes. We are still evaluating our stat session model, but what we typically do is meet with departments on a monthly basis. When we collect the data, we identify the areas where they're performing well, what's driving that, and what are the lessons we can learn, what are the areas where we're not doing so well, and we need to really drill down and understand what's driving those performance issues and focus on moving the needle. And then if there's a significant issue that we want to highlight or an issue that crosses departments, we have a session where we bring everybody together. Our COO chairs that panel, and we actually have a collaborative discussion around how do we move the needle. So we are in our this is the 4th month where we've collected data. The model seems to be working. We've seen some strong success, but we still have a long way to go in terms of really fully stabilizing.
Well, that's a great description of the program, and also a good segue into a question that I want to ask later about how do we evolve the performance stat model to both as technology evolves, but also as leadership changes and as we move through transition. I think it's a really important question that I promise to get back to later in the Hangout. But before we do, Matt Power, do we have audio? Can we hear you? Matt, are you there? Nope. Still no audio? All right. Well, Matt, hang tight. Matt can also communicate to us through the chat. So if there are questions for Matt when we get to when we get into some more questions, I want you to still be there so you can communicate using the chat functionality. If you can just remute your microphone, though, because it is providing a bunch of feedback. Fortunately, I know a little bit about the program in Maryland. Matt took over after there was a huge gaping hole left in the program in Maryland. Now, Matt has ably taken over the job as the State Stat Director in Maryland, job that I formerly held, and has done a great job really changing also the process and the approach based on his own leadership stuff. So really looking forward to seeing how it goes. But State Stat in Maryland is a traditional performance stat model that was borrowed and taken directly from City Stat in Baltimore. When the governor was mayor, he implemented it in the city. And then when he was there in the city, really adopted it very widely from the NYPD's implementation of CompStat in New York City and used a lot of the same philosophy of distributing resources based on need, using GIS as sort of a centerpiece for solving problems. The map was sort of the cornerstone of the deployment at CityStat in the early years, and that sort of grew along with the work that we did at the state level. And really, at its core was taking data from across the enterprise of government and aligning it to solving really hard problems. And that's really what we did at StateStat. We did that both in the implementation of the performance management piece, which was done both for programs and operations at the state level, but then we also rolled all of that work up into what we called the delivery unit. We had a high level framework that was shaped by 15 strategic goals that the governor articulated, where we took the data we were looking at on a daily basis for overseeing about 85% of the state's budget, a comparable amount of the workforce. We rolled that up into aligning with the agencies through these subject matter stats that coincided with those 15 strategic goals. But all of you have great web presence also, so you can go onto your websites and see them for more information. We'll also distribute links and information about how to access some of the information about your particular programs after this. And Daniel, we're still having, I think, difficulty getting a hold of Daniel. So what we'll have to do is we'll have to reschedule a one-on-one hangout with Daniel Hadley from Somerset, because Somerset is a city that is doing some incredibly innovative work, particularly around stat. They're one of the originals. The mayor in the city. Matt's gone. Yep. So the mayor in the city of Somerville has been incredibly innovative and real leader in using data to drive performance and outcomes in the city of Somerville. And so I think if we have the opportunity, we'll certainly bring Daniel back in. So I'd like to go back and focus on a couple of questions. The first question I wanted to pose, and I think I'd like to start with Emily on this question, and that is, I think that one of the most critical aspects for our use of performance and data-driven government and GovStat in the state of Maryland was leadership. Governor O'Malley was an incredible advocate for this work, obviously did this work when he was mayor of the city, and I know that I wouldn't have been able to hit the mark on so many of the things that I was doing in Maryland without his leadership. And I think leadership is incredibly important. But there kind of begs the question, which is, do you need to have an invested leader in order to be able to do this work? Or can you do this work and have it start off organically, either from an administrative perspective, a program perspective? It's almost like the chicken and the egg question, the leader and the performance-driven, data-driven government question. So, Emily, I'd love to hear your feedback and kind of your thoughts around that question.
I could talk for a very long time about this, but I'll try to shorten my answer. My thought is that I think it really does take the leadership who is going to not just make the sort of make sure that data is a focus, but really how we take that data, how we interpret that data, and how we use that data to manage our operations. I think that is absolutely critical. So the leader who started our STAT program, I think it's a great example because she's been in the city for the entire duration for when we've had a STAT program in place, but she's been in different roles. And so when she was leading that program, and the COO and the mayor were very adamant about having data, using data to manage their operations, the program did great things, and it really was sort of the one of the core drivers of where the city focused its resources, where it focused its priorities, and how it managed departments. She then stepped away from the program into more of an operational role. Leadership changed. It wasn't as much of a priority, and the program, and when I say leadership, I mean both the administration as well as a lot of the commissioners or the leaders of the departments. We got new folks in. They knew they had to collect the data, but it sort of got pushed to an admin level, and people they stopped using it. They stopped sort of letting data drive or help to drive some of their decisions. And then when she re-engaged and really set the tone from the top that the data is critical, and that she expects commissioners to manage their operations using that data, the program sort of was reborn. I think it does, however, take more than just the leader. You have to have a team who's really engaged in working with departments and helping to spread that message from the ground up as well. And then the last thing I think I'll say is that in an ideal world where you had great data and you could just you could easily pull the data, easily see trends, and easily identify where there were issues, somewhat like what happens in the private sector, then perhaps the leadership is not as critical, and the data itself is evidence for how it can be used. But I think for most of, or at least what we've seen in most of the other cities I've talked about, in government that's not the case. You've got to make the use of the data that you have. You have to actively engage with the data and really work to understand how you can use it to manage your performance. And in that situation, I think that the leadership does play a critical role.
And Oliver, I'd love to get your opinion also on sort of what came first, because I know that the mayor was so focused on BlightStat, used BlightStat as sort of a springboard, but now you're sort of proliferating the practice across a lot of different areas in your work portfolio. And so I'd love to just learn a little bit more from you around what you think about leadership and how it's structured in New Orleans.
Yeah, I think leadership is absolutely critical. It's the prerequisite to any of this happening. But I think it's also incumbent upon the administrators of a performance management system, and I take it that's probably who's listening in today, to understand that there are non-trivial downsides to performance management for political leadership, for the departments you're working with, and to be cognizant of that and making sure that you're always addressing that. Because what performance management could be, you're opening up what could be a lot of dirty laundry. And you have to make sure that the various constituents that you're working with, that the benefits of this enterprise is going to outweigh the costs that come up. Because we created plenty of negative stories in the paper that certainly no political advisor of the mayor wants to read, and the mayor himself doesn't want to read. But you need a leader who's going to be able to see the big picture vision of this and see that at the end of the day, the improvement you're going to get from having quality services, from having a reputation for professionalizing the management in your organization, that those big picture issues are going to outweigh the small little annoying stories or columns that come up. And also to the leaders within your departments, there are non-trivial downsides to this effort for them. They're going to have potentially damaging information released that's going to that may reflect poorly on their management decisions, on their competency as a manager, and they are understandably might be resistant to that effort. So I think you have to be able to bring them on your side, show that you're not out there to slap people on the wrist. You're there to help departments use data to equip them to be more effective, and in order to help them make their case, whatever it may be, in terms of resource decisions or policy changes to more senior leadership.
Yeah, I think that, I think one of the questions that we get a lot when we're out in the field is, how do you overcome that resistance? Because I think that resistance, I don't think there's any of us that are, and I've had conversations with all of you independently that haven't, faced that resistance. And I do think leadership plays a big role in thinking about resistance and overcoming resistance. And I know that Matt wanted to jump in here, because I see in the chat that he wanted to jump in. Can we test your mic again, Matt? Is he still muted? Let's see. Try now, Matt. Can you unmute yourself, maybe? No? All right. So let's see. Let's just keep, and if Matt, if you want to, you can old school chat in with some typing in some, and I'll be happy to read it in my best Matt Power impersonation, which I've been honing over the years. So if you go ahead and do that, then I'm so sorry that this is incredibly frustrating, I know, for you and for all of us. But Chad, I think this is a good time for you to kind of come in, because you're now, in sort of a new era of city stat in the city where a lot of this work started. And I think it would be great to get from your perspective, how has the Baltimore program been able to survive multiple mayors, been able to survive multiple administration changes, both, within mayoral runs, and also just, how is it that you've been able to craft changes in the entire model itself to meld to the management style of Mayor Rawlings Blake now? So just a little bit of background would be great for that.
Sure. I think in the beginning, the leadership is really, really important and is always important for it surviving. I think it was running for 6 years plus, right, before we split, before there was a mayoral transition. So I think by that point, it was a lot easier to justify its existence. And I think when there was a transition, they did a really good job of saying, here's how this can help you quickly transition and learn about what's going on in the agencies and drive the ship from. So I think survival was about being relevant and useful leading up to that, so that it wasn't just we were trying to justify our own existence. We were showing that we could be value added to any mayor, not just one mayor who started it. I think, and then with that, it evolves to fit the style of the leader. So when the second mayor came in, Mayor Sheila Dixon, that's when we started a couple of those outcome-centered meetings. So we didn't completely change the whole strategy for how it works, but we added a clean stack, which was focused on just making the city clean. So it wasn't just one agency, it was solid waste, housing, the control board that adjudicates citations. We got them all in there to talk about issues around making the city clean. That's also the same year we started GovStat, where we got multiple partners in there. It wasn't just city agencies, it was multiple criminal justice partners in there to discuss reducing gun violence. So And that came from that mayor. With the third mayor, Mayor Rawlings Blake, our current mayor, she's again very supportive and bought into the program. And one of the things that we've done is add outcome meetings where we also have nonprofit partners in there. So we added GovStat in 2011, which is focused around reducing domestic violence. And we have our strong partner in the House of Ruth, which is a nonprofit partner that helps with services for women who are victims of domestic violence. And then we just recently added Watershed Stat, which brings in nonprofit partners dedicated to cleaning up the harbor and the watershed, surrounding watershed. So I think the short answer is we have to remain relevant. We can't just survive by being a hammer. We've got, the team of analysts have to be strong, and they have to know what's going on in the agencies in order to provide good information to the executive. And if you do all that, then I think it's easier to survive, and you then make tailored changes to the style of the executive in charge.
I think that is, and as we saw when we were doing this in Maryland, and Matt, one last time, are you there? No. Matt? I hear something, but not Matt's voice. All right, we'll have to have another conversation with both Matt and Daniel. But to push the conversation along, I would like to talk a little bit about outcomes, and I think that you alluded, Chad, to this a little bit in sort of how you've sort of reshaped the way that you're approaching performance management. So you're not sort of replicating those traditional silos of government, but that you're actually trying to align data resources to solving problems that may cut across agencies. And I think we're seeing that as an approach that's being taken by a lot of different data-driven government implementers across really the globe. But I think that one of the key things is that ROI story, and thinking about the ROI story. What are the returns? How are we moving the needle in producing results as when it comes to water quality, producing results when it comes to the safety of our citizens? What are some of those examples, or what are some of the things? And I know that, Oliver, you have some great examples that we saw when we were down in New Orleans around your housing stock and blight and some of the issues that you've been sort of laser focused on. So I'd love to get just a sense from everyone, sort of what are some of those big outcomes that you have been tracking and that you have really seen this approach move the needle on in a way that's had both sort of that traditional ROI impact. Matt, I'm sure that you can talk, if you were plugged in right now, Matt, I'm sure you would talk about some of the great savings that Maryland has had, reducing overtime in some of their largest agencies and scaling some of the things that they were able to do in those overtime reductions across multiple agencies because of the platform. And then also, their ability to do and really to communicate effectively what is working and also what is not working when they're measuring the success of certain implementations. So why don't we go ahead and start with Emily and get some of what she would consider to be some of the biggest added value from using data to sort of drive results, whether it's in in the former approach that you were taking, Emily, or even I know that you're already realizing some of those outcomes now in the sort of reformatted 4 approach. So Emily, why don't we just start with you?
Sure. So I'm going to talk to some of the results that we're seeing in our current program in the For Atlanta approach, recognizing that we're still sort of in that early stage. Our initial focus on For Atlanta, where we're spending probably 80% of our time, are on measuring metrics that relate to public-facing services. So looking at what are the services that our citizens care most about. So filling potholes, repairing sidewalks, making sure that issues with water bills are resolved, making sure that the trash gets picked up, those basic services. And we're really focusing here because we're getting ready to launch a 311 program in Atlanta, and we want to make sure that when we go live with 311 that we are able to meet the commitments that we're going to be promising to our citizens. So if we say that we will fill a pothole within 3 days, we know good and well that we can do that 90% of the time. And so we're really trying to align our focus right there and really tracking at a very granular level what those services are and how we're performing. Just in the 4 months since we've started tracking this data, I'll talk specifically to our Department of Public Works. by having that visibility and by making sure that the commissioner and that all of his deputies and the managers within those offices understand why the metrics are important, understand how the metrics are being used, and understand that it's not just to be intended to be a stick, but it really is measuring this data really is critical to making sure that we can meet the commitments that we provide to our citizens. We've seen increases in the 20 to 30% range in their performance. So really, shining a flashlight on what the performance is that they're doing, making sure that they're aware of why the information is important, and then committing to getting them the resources, even in a constrained budget environment, if they need the resources. So if they need another bucket truck to be able to fix street lights, working with them to find those resources, we've been able to move the needle. The other thing that I'll just quickly touch on is that in addition to the core performance management component, we're using very similar strategies with our operations teams, and we're already seeing results there as well. So any operations project that we are taking on, at the very beginning, we're setting quantitative targets and metrics that will measure our progress. And on a monthly basis, we're tracking that data through the Fort Atlanta program, and we're actually tracking how the different elements of our initiatives are moving the needle. And so we can, we've launched an e-citation pilot, which is an electronic citation pilot. We've already been able to demonstrate results there. We're getting ready to launch a new false alarm program in the city, and we've already set, we've set targets. We've worked with our vendor and the contract we've put in place to make sure that that whole contract is structured on meeting the performance targets that we've hit. So I think for us, it's really about sort of putting the visibility on the data and making sure that we use that data to measure our performance and to hold ourselves and departments accountable.
That's excellent. And I just want to remind everyone that's listening in that you can ask questions of everyone on our panel, or consistent with the questions that we're talking about, or if you have your own questions, by tweeting us using the hashtag #GovStat or tweeting us at Socrata, and we'll be happy to take your questions. So, and we have some in the pipeline. I'm going to get to them. I'd love to get some more. So, Chad, why don't you talk a little bit about your story as well?
Sure, in terms of outcomes and the successes. So I think, in the beginning, some of the quick ones, or some of the more traditional successes we were seeing, were the 48-hour pothole guarantee, where they mapped out the process and said, all right, we're going to get all potholes filled in 48 hours. We've done the same with graffiti, where basically every graffiti request is done in under 3 days. I think as we've evolved, there's certain successes which have been more outcome focused. So I brought up GovStat before. I think that's a big one, where we decreased homicides and shootings, annual homicide and shootings from 2007 by over 30%, and that was also coupled with a decrease in arrests and release without charges. So by having a strategy of focusing on bad guys with guns and gun offenders, we saw a significant decrease in that outcome. Some non-public safety ones, we were having a problem with water bills about 2 years ago, really for years, but I think people just finally had enough a couple years ago, and we used a lot of data, a lot of drilling down, and the stat meetings to significantly decrease the number of estimated bills that were going out. So we haven't eliminated them, but our goal was 0 estimates. We've significantly decreased them, and the ones that we know we'll be estimating, we have a plan for addressing those. And I really think the stat process, and particularly the analysts assigned to water, played a pivotal role in making that happen. It wasn't just a sort of monitoring and accountability role at these meetings. He really got involved with the agency because he understood the data really well to help drive their action on that. We just started the watershed one, so I can't claim to say we've improved the water quality in the harbor significantly, but that'll be obviously what we look at with that meeting. And the meetings themselves will be focused on more tactical targets, and hopefully by achieving those, we'll see a correlation with an improvement in water quality.
So Maryland has BayStat, which we're familiar, some of us are familiar with. So are you coordinating the work of BayStat with your WaterStat, and trying to do do some, I know that with GovStat, you've got your public safety stats from Maryland that are sort of piping into the city stat, but are you doing any work across on the water quality stat?
We started looking into that. We have not. We're not completely on the same page, I'd say, but I think we're getting partners into the room that are in both meetings, and I think you're starting to see the benefit. We're starting to see the benefits of having non-city partners in there and some partners on the state level. So, short answer is no. We are not completely coordinating on it, but over time, I think it's gonna. They're going to go more hand in hand in terms of improving the water quality.
Okay, and Oliver, would you like to chime in and talk about some of the outcomes that you've realized through your data-driven work in New Orleans?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think having the ability to focus on high-level issues that cuts across departments is one of the big value adds that a performance management program or shop can add to an organization. I've talked about the blight example before, which is certainly an example of that. Another one that our shop has focused a lot on is our contracting and payables process. So when this administration came to office, our capital recovery program from Hurricane Katrina, which is 5 years before we came to office, was just slow as can be. And the reason why it was so slow is because the nuts and bolts contracting and procurement and payables process was just absolutely as slow as can be. And contracts would languish in either departments or the law departments for months and months, and sometimes just actually get lost, like the physical paper contract would get lost. And by focusing on these downline logistics of making sure that those types of back office processes are working like clockwork, you can have, there's a domino effect in terms of the organization's ability to deliver services efficiently and effectively. So when we started the process, it took us an average of over 66 days with a totally crazy distribution. We'd have crazy outliers on the far end of the bell curve to process a contract from the department through various policy and financial approvals, through the law department, which takes understandably the longest time, to finally getting signed by the mayor. So it took an average of an embarrassing 66 days. And by focusing on this issue for a good 2 years, we saw steady progress. And in the last meeting, we had just gotten our average down to 31 days, and the median was about 21 or 22. So that was, we've cut that time in by less than half. And because of that, we're on schedule with a very ambitious, very complicated capital projects program. And they've been able to do that because there's now a reliable procurement and contracting process. So projects can get designed quickly, built quickly. If there's a change order, we can do that change order without being falling into bureaucratic paralysis. Yeah. So there's the example.
Okay, great. No, thank you. And I think that bureaucratic paralysis is an interesting assessment. One of the questions that we're actually getting from Twitter is more about that resistance, and how do you overcome resistance? And I think that we've all had experience overcoming that resistance. I see Emily sort of vigorously shaking her head, so I think that we've all had this opportunity to deal with it. And maybe, Emily, we could start with you. Just, what are some of the strategies that you've employed for some of the people that are starting this work or are engaged in this work, that are facing that sort of, I call it permafrost, that sort of entrenched culture that, of anti-change? How do you get data-driven government, the message of data-driven government, to penetrate into maybe some of the harder to move cultures in government?
I think we faced a significant amount of pushback from departments, partly because there's the resistance to change, but partly because they've seen the program not work before. And so what's different? How are you going to prove your value? How are you actually going to use this data versus it being an exercise in just collecting data? I think the two most important things that we have done, and I think a number of you have mentioned this in some of the previous comments, the first is making sure that we call them portfolio managers, but basically the team members who are interfacing directly and working day-to-day with the departments, making sure that they really focus first on building the relationships, starting at the ground up, and making sure that they're really taking the time to get to know their department and the operations of that department, having those conversations about, well, what are the things that are important to you, and if you could pick what we track, what would you pick, and how does that relate to your performance, and starting the conversation there. I think the second piece is being very focused on providing consistent feedback about what the data is telling us, why the data is important, and how we're using it, so that they understand and actually see that the data is being used, and we're proving ourselves as we go. But it's really about having that relationship and constant communication about why the data is important. That being said, it's a different process for every department, and we're there with some departments, we're getting there with others, and there are a few that are we're still sort of trying to pull along if we can.
Great. And we'll get back to that. I definitely think that could be a webinar all on its own, is just sort of overcoming those types of barriers or the perceived barriers to doing this work when you're doing this. I do want to, in the interest of time, because I want to there are a lot of questions, I want to get to the questions, so I want to also get to the last kind of topic that we promised the listeners or the participants that we would get to, which is citizen engagement. Citizen engagement, I think for me, was probably the stickiest place where the devil is in the details when it comes to citizen engagement. And once you sort of like open Pandora's box, it can be really Pandora's box. And you have to have the infrastructure to respond to citizen engagement. You have to have the willingness to be, transparency is one thing, but this is, really allowing citizens to get into the feedback loop is, what I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about citizen engagement. So I would love to get a sense from you, kind of what you're doing around citizen engagement, if you're doing things around citizen engagement, where your thinking is, and maybe some of the best practices that you've identified along the way. And so maybe Chad, if you want to get started and talk a little bit about that, and we'll kind of open it up to others.
Sure, I got two quick ones. The first one is we have a 311 mobile application now. So we've always had 311 being able to call in, but now you can snap a picture of the mobile app. So that's one of our major intakes for citizen engagement. And then the other one that we sort of just jumped into is we are sending a very quick 7-question survey back to citizens that have called in a service request and have left their email. So very quick 7-question survey. First one is, was the issue resolved? And then the other ones are questions about satisfaction level overall and with the call taker. And then there's one for open-ended comments they provide. So we started out about a month ago. We just presented that to in WaterStat today, earlier this morning, and I think it's a good controlled way to get productive citizen feedback that you can immediately use to drive the agency progress. Like as soon as we brought it up, it changes the tone of the conversation, because now it's not me speculating on how the citizens are reacting to what they're doing. It's, hey, look, this is the reaction directly from the citizens. The stuff we've been saying isn't because we are just looking for things to pick at. We know this is stuff that annoys citizens when we do it this way, and you can see. And we also put up the stuff where they were really happy too, and said, hey, here's some where they're really satisfied with the work you're doing, and then here's where they're really dissatisfied, and it's because of X, Y, and Z, and how can we start hammering away at making this better. So those are my two quick ones.
I think actually the last point that you just made is really important to the conversation we were just having, which is, I think that a lot of times there's this sort of classic perception of the work that we do in performance stat that's been maybe sensationalized in certain television programs and things like that, where it is like the hammer, and we are, in the room really trying to like intimidate people into results, which is prompting bad actors and bad outcomes. And the reality is that you have to celebrate wins. You have to make a connection to the work that's happening on the front line, and that connection happens through feedback, and feedback really is coming from our constituencies, right? And that's not necessarily just constituencies internal to government. So I think it's a great point to talk about using citizen feedback as part of that incentive to get people engaged in the process, and the desire to want to meet everyone's needs is something that I think drives a lot of us in the work that we're doing. So I think that was an excellent point. Thanks, Chad, for that. Oliver, do you have anything that you want to talk about in terms of citizen engagement in the city?
Yeah, certainly. All our STAT programs are public, and that can be really scary to have a management conversation with 100, 150 flies on the wall. But I think it's been really helpful and made our programs much more constructive. And we help, having the public there, we're able to have a finger on the pulse of really what is most important to citizens. We're also find out issues that we may not have thought about, but citizens know a lot better than actually we do. So that's very helpful. And I think the whole process helps you build trust with your citizens, that you are indeed addressing these issues seriously and professionally and honestly. And having the trust of your citizens pays enormous dividends in terms of delivering higher quality services.
Okay, well, I think that certainly makes a lot of sense, and I think that ultimately our ultimate customers are the citizens of all of the states and cities and counties that we are working for, living in, and so I think that is certainly important. I want to get to some more questions, and so there's sort of a follow-up question to the question about some of that pushback and what are the strategies, and I want to talk about some of the things that we did in Maryland on Matt's behalf, and I just promised Matt that I'm going to give him like an Oprah style one-on-one, and that way we can get to the bottom of what he's doing there in the state of Maryland. But I do want to talk a little bit about how do you overcome those challenges and the key to overcoming resistance, what I found, and please chime in if you think I'm wrong, was making connections to the realities of the work on the front line. So what happened was, I found the most resistance is when we were taking a sort of top-down approach of solving problems instead of really understanding the problem in the actual practice of delivering the service or creating the policy or whatever the issue is that we were trying to unpack with the data. And I found that when I really got to penetrate through the permafrost or through some of that pushback and got into the front line and really understood the challenges of the people who were trying to deliver those services and trying to effectuate that change. And I kept that in very tight focus when we were trying to really resolve those problems, that it started to create in the organization a lot of traction, and then you have to really celebrate that traction and figure out who it is your evangelists are across your organization and bring them up through. And I found that doing that really enabled us to really, in some of the tougher agencies that you're going to be working with when you're doing this, is finding the people who are actually doing the work, celebrating the wins, celebrating their embrace of the sort of process, and then making sure that you are keep focused on making sure the data you're looking at makes sense to the people who are doing the work, that the questions that are being asked make sense and are being asked and prompted by the same people. So I think that, and if anyone else wants to sort of chime in there, we have a lot of questions though, so I wouldn't mind also going to the next one, which is when we're getting started. And we talked a little bit in the last Hangout about getting started. So I know that Mike from Burlington is asking a question, Burlington, Vermont, which is a very cool city if you haven't been there, and about how do you get started? Do you kind of do a phased approach when you're getting started, or do you try to go and just full bore, bring everyone in and do a larger sort of proliferation? And I think, Oliver, you talked a little bit about the phased approach that you took. Chad, you're really kind of coming into a very well-developed program. But I'd like to get from, and chime in, whoever wants to answer this, really kind of how did you really how would you recommend getting started if you were doing this in another city? Would you recommend that phased approach, or sort of the opening the curtains and doing a enterprise-wide approach?
I would recommend a phased approach. Sorry, guys. But I wouldn't think of it, if I may suggest, I wouldn't think of it in terms of which department do you want to start with. I would start with what problem do you want to address. And I think you purposely seek out a problem that cuts across departments. Because what you have to do is show the value. If the driver of a performance management system within your organization, you have to show that the benefits of this project is going to outweigh the costs, and the costs are real. So if you can say, take a problem like infrastructure or quality of life issues or environmental issues or whatever it may be, but something that involves multiple departments who may not otherwise have had an opportunity to collaborate and talk about how their services can be coordinated better to address that problem. I think that's really where a place to start, rather than I'm going to pick one department, because you also have to be cognizant of treating people fairly, and you don't want to create a situation in which one particular department head is receiving a great deal of scrutiny and other department heads are getting a free pass. But I think if you reframe it around solving high priority issues that are important to the citizens and your mayor, you can get around that.
And so you're thinking about taking a problem and then bringing in maybe one or two agencies to start that are involved in the resolution of that problem, and that being the approach instead of, and I see a high value in that, because I do think that when we started in Maryland, I mean, we went with the agency approach, and I do think it kind of replicated the same silos, and what we realized very fast was that, if I want to make kids safer, I can't just look at the Department of Juvenile Services. I need to look at the Department of Education, I need to look at the Department of Juvenile Services, Social Services, Public Safety, parks and recs at the city level, so there's a whole bunch of things that are impacting my ability to keep kids safe. And I think that you're right, but I do think that sometimes getting started is the hardest part. And so for smaller jurisdictions, it may be that you have a couple of problems that are pressing and important to your people, and they are sort of self-contained in one agency, and it might make sense to go and try to figure out where the data is and get the data mobilized to help start solving problems there. I think it is going to really make a big difference on geography, demographic data. There's a few things that, and there are ways that you can sort of, from an assessment perspective, figure out what would be the best approach. Anyone else have anything they want to add to that on the getting started bit? If not, I've got a good question that's come in, and I'd love to get this both from Chad and Emily on this one, which is, what methods do you use to collect data? I know, Chad, that when we started in Maryland and in Baltimore, I mean, we used everything from, I like to call it sort of the caveman approach. We were chiseling information onto rocks, but it's actually hashtags on paper. And then, Excel spreadsheets was the common denominator, and it still is for many governments. Yeah. And then we've increased our portfolio of sophisticated data collection mechanisms since those days, but a lot of stuff is still operating in Excel. And so I'd love to get from you kind of, how are you collecting data, what are you doing, and also from Emily, I think it would be great to hear from you on this one.
Sure, I'll try and be quick. The first one is, I'll make a plug for Open Baltimore and Socrata. We're trying to post as many templates as we can online, so you can see what we collect and how we collect it. It's all Excel, really. We put it on the agency to provide us with the data, so my team's not going in and counting, how many potholes were closed. That comes from them. And it's all Excel, and I think the reason that that's lasted for 13 years is the flexibility it gives you to change a measure on the fly, or add a new one, or get rid of ones that are outdated. And I think that's why it's been so useful, even though it's very low tech. We are doing a project this summer to look at where all the data comes from, and we're not going to get it all done in 1 week. but there will still be on the ground level, hash marks on pieces of paper. I don't know if you'll ever get rid of that for certain metrics, but we're exploring ways to automate some of it.
Great. So we spent a significant amount of time, or we have over the last 6 months, really going in and working with departments to understand their source systems. So we are getting hands-on with the source systems and how we extract data, what data is there, how we can use that data in its raw form. But the way we track data and the way we report monthly is through Excel. Actually, specifically, we use Google Docs. So we are, unfortunately, our pockets are not quite deep enough just yet to work with Socrata. We're using a visualization tool called
They don't need to be that deep.
we have a very cheap tool, but it's basically just a visualization tool that sits on top of our Google Doc, and each month our portfolio managers, they pull the data, they work with departments. Some data is raw, some data is already calculated. They get it into the final format, then they use the visualization tool to create dashboards and to look at the data. We're also working with our IT department to think about, in the long term, can we build a data warehouse where we don't have to know the back-end systems quite as well and get into the nuts and bolts, but that we can extract the data from from that core data set, get it into the data warehouse, and then have a platform on top of that. So that's an 18-month to 2-year project.
Great. So I want to apologize for all the technical difficulties. I owe everyone who's tuning in a conversation with Daniel and a conversation with Matt, which I promised to make good on. I want to thank everybody for participating. I think I actually hear Matt Power trying to chime in right now. I don't know if that's the case. But Matt, if you want to give everyone a nice wave, and sorry that I didn't get to you. We are going to post a recording of this on our website, and feel free to access it there. We will also be able to take questions offline, so let me know if any of our viewers have any questions or any ideas that they'd like to see some content sort of parsed out with this group and maybe in a future hangout. But I really just want to thank everyone for participating. Emily, Chad, Oliver, Matt, thank you so much for hanging out with us today. Remember that you can always follow us at Socrata. I'm at BI Blauer, and I'll be sure to send links and post them with the content of today's work. So thank you, thank you, thank you, and I look forward to seeing you in a few weeks again for our next hangout. So have a good one, and happy summer.